My husband kept me out of sight because he was ashamed of my plus-size body. But what he did not know was that the company everyone admired was legally mine. She is not my wife, Aaliyah Vow said with a polished smile, and the lie landed more sharply than any insult Zora Whitmore had heard in their 12 years of marriage. The charity auction glittered beneath the chandeliers of the Art Institute of Chicago, where champagne glasses caught the light and old money moved through the marble hall in tailored black and ivory. A reporter had noticed Zora standing near Callum and asked the obvious question. Callum had looked at her gold earrings, her deep brown skin, and the elegant black gown shaped to her plus-size figure. Then he glanced toward the investors watching from across the room. "She works for me," he added. For one suspended second, the music seemed to fade. Zora felt the metallic clasp of her purse press into her palm, but her face did not change. She did not correct him. She did not ask why the man who wore her wedding ring had erased her with 6 quiet words. Instead, she gave the reporter a small, gracious nod and stepped away. Behind her, Callum resumed the conversation as though nothing had happened. He laughed at the right moment. He raised his glass. He accepted praise for the real estate empire that bore his name. No one in the room knew that Zora had written the market strategy that won his first major contract. No one knew she had sold the pearl bracelet her mother left her to cover the rent on his first office. No one knew that, for years, she had stayed awake beside stacks of reports, finding the patterns Callum later presented as his own instincts. She had once believed privacy was part of loving an ambitious man. When he stopped bringing her to company dinners, he said the rooms were political. When he removed their wedding photograph from his office, he said investors preferred clean design. When his assistant began booking gala tables for one, he said Zora would be bored. Each excuse had arrived gently, dressed in concern, until she could no longer see the cage forming around her. Tonight, the door had finally closed. From the far end of the gallery, she watched Callum charm a silver-haired donor beneath a painting worth more than their first home. He looked confident, admired, completely at ease in the world she had helped him enter. Then his eyes found hers. For the briefest moment, guilt disturbed his smile. Zora held his gaze without anger. That unsettled him more than tears would have. She turned and walked toward the coat room, her heels steady against the marble. In the reflection of a dark museum window, she saw a beautiful black woman standing tall, not hidden, not diminished, and not confused anymore. By the time Callum returned to their penthouse that night, Zora had placed a thick folder on the glass dining table. Beside it rested her wedding ring. He looked from the papers to her face and gave a tired sigh, as if her pain were an inconvenience. "You are overreacting," he said. Zora slowly closed the final clasp on her suitcase. "No," she replied. "I am finally seeing clearly." The folder on the table contained more than memories. It held contracts, dated research reports, archived emails, and ownership records bearing Zora Whitmore's name. For years, she had allowed Callum to present her work as part of Voss Capital because she believed marriage meant building one future together. Now, under the cold light above their dining table, every page told a different story. Callum opened the folder and scanned the first document, then the second. His expression tightened when he reached the original market analysis that had secured his company's first major investor. Zora had written it in a cramped apartment 12 years earlier, balancing a laptop on her knees while rain tapped against the windows. Callum had paced behind her, too anxious to sit, repeating that everything depended on the meeting the next morning. She had worked until nearly 3 o'clock, then ironed his shirt while he slept. The investor called Callum brilliant. Callum never corrected him. At first, Zora had not minded. She had loved the way his face changed when hope returned to it. She had believed his success belonged to both of them. Their first office was barely 900 square feet, with exposed pipes, second-hand desks, and a coffee maker that leaked across the counter. Zora built client profiles, studied neighborhood trends, and discovered which properties would attract long-term tenants before larger firms noticed them. Callum gave the presentations. She sat near the back and watched people praise him for understanding markets he had learned through her notes. As the company grew, the distance between them grew with it. He stopped saying "we" during interviews. Her name disappeared from reports. When a magazine photographed the executive team, Callum asked her to step outside because the article was focused on leadership. Zora had been the only black woman in the room, and the only person whose work appeared in every folder on the table. She remembered standing in the hallway afterward, holding 2 cups of coffee while strangers walked past without knowing who she was. Later, Callum kissed her forehead and thanked her for understanding. That had become his favorite word whenever he wanted her to accept less. Understanding meant staying home from investor dinners. Understanding meant entering hotels through side doors when his associates were nearby. Understanding meant smiling when he introduced her as a consultant instead of his wife. Zora had mistaken endurance for loyalty until the museum gala stripped the illusion away. Callum closed the folder and looked at her suitcase. "What exactly are you planning to do with this?" he asked. His voice remained controlled, but his fingers rested too firmly on the documents. Zora fastened the belt of her coat. "Protect what belongs to me." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You cannot separate your work from this company now." Zora met his eyes. The contracts already did. For the first time that night, Callum looked afraid. Not of losing her. Not yet. He was afraid of losing control over the story he had told about himself. Zora understood that with painful clarity. She lifted the handle of her suitcase and walked toward the door. Behind her, the city lights reflected across the glass table, dividing his face into fragments. "Where will you go?" he called. Zora paused with her hand on the door, but she did not turn. "Around. Somewhere I do not have to disappear." Then she stepped into the hallway, carrying everything he had underestimated with her. The elevator doors closed before Callum reached the hallway, leaving Zora alone with the soft hum of cables carrying her toward the lobby. She watched the numbers descend and felt no triumph, only the strange quiet that comes when a truth has finally become impossible to deny. For years, she had imagined leaving as a storm of accusations and broken promises. Instead, it arrived as a single suitcase, a folder of documents, and the steady reflection of her own face in polished steel. Outside, Chicago had gone silver with early morning rain. Zora placed her suitcase in the back of a waiting car and gave the driver an address in Bronzeville. It belonged to Nadine Cole, an old college friend who had offered her guest room months earlier, after noticing how often Zora canceled dinner because Callum needed her somewhere else. Zora had always answered that everything was fine. Now, as the car moved south along Lakeshore Drive, she understood how much effort it had taken to maintain that lie. Her phone began to vibrate before they reached Roosevelt Road. Callum called 3 times. Then came a message telling her to return so they could discuss the situation like adults. Another warned her not to make private business public. The last one was softer. He said he was sorry that she had misunderstood him. Zora read it once, then turned off the screen. He had not apologized for denying her. He had apologized for the consequences. At Nadine's townhouse, the porch light was already on. Nadine opened the door wearing a gray robe and holding 2 mugs of coffee. She did not ask Zora whether she was certain. She simply stepped aside and said, "Your room is ready." That kindness nearly broke the calm Zora had carried all night. She set her suitcase down, wrapped both hands around the warm mug, and stood in a kitchen filled with the smell of cinnamon and fresh bread. Nothing in the room was expensive, yet she felt more welcome there than she had in the penthouse Callum called their home. By noon, Zora had contacted an attorney named Miriam Cross, a precise woman with silver-framed glasses and no patience for vague answers. They met in a quiet office overlooking the river. Miriam examined the contracts, authorship records, and archived files Zora had preserved. "He may control the company," she said, "but he does not control work you legally created before assigning any rights." Zora looked through the window at the bridges rising over dark water. For the first time, the future did not appear empty. It appeared unwritten. Miriam prepared formal notices protecting Zora's intellectual property and preventing Voss Capital from using several unreleased research models without permission. Zora also filed for divorce. She requested no public statement and no dramatic settlement. She asked only for what the law recognized as hers. Callum responded through his attorneys before sunset. His language was polished, defensive, and filled with references to reputation. He offered money if she agreed to remain silent. Zora declined. She was not interested in selling the truth back to the man who had spent years hiding it. 3 days later, she returned to the penthouse while Callum was at work. She took her mother's photographs, her books, her winter coats, and the blue ceramic bowl she had bought before their marriage. She left behind the designer furniture, the crystal glasses, and every framed award bearing his name. On the dining table, she placed the keys beside a copy of the divorce filing. Nothing else. When Callum came home that evening, he found the rooms perfectly arranged and completely changed. Zora had not shouted. She had not embarrassed him. She had simply removed everything that had made the place feel alive, including herself. Bronzeville gave Zora something the penthouse never had: room to breathe. For the first few weeks, she woke before sunrise in Nadine's guest room and listened to the city begin outside the window. Buses sighed at the curb. Delivery trucks rolled past on wet pavement. Somewhere below, a bakery opened its ovens, and the warm scent of cinnamon reached the second floor before daylight touched the brick buildings. Zora began each morning with coffee, a legal pad, and the research models Callum could no longer use without her permission. At first, she accepted small consulting jobs from neighborhood businesses that larger firms ignored. A family-owned bookstore wanted to understand why online sales had fallen. A beauty salon needed help reaching women over 40. A clothing designer had spent years being told there was no serious market for elegant plus-size fashion. Zora listened to each owner with the attention she had once given billion-dollar presentations. She noticed patterns others dismissed. These women were not asking to be rescued by advertising. They were asking to be seen accurately. That became the beginning of Aaliyah House. Zora rented a narrow second-floor workspace above the bakery for $1,200 a month. The floorboards creaked, the windows rattled in winter, and the radiator clanged whenever the temperature dropped below 30 degrees. She painted the walls herself in a warm ivory color and carried a second-hand desk up the stairs with Nadine's help. On the first morning, there was no staff, no receptionist, and no polished sign in the lobby. There was only Zora, her laptop, and a handwritten sentence taped above the desk. No woman should have to disappear to make someone else look powerful. The company grew one honest campaign at a time. Zora created photographs that showed mature black women laughing without being reduced to stereotypes. She advised retailers to stop hiding larger sizes in the back of their stores. She built focus groups where women could speak without being interrupted by executives explaining what they were supposed to want. Her work was precise, but it was also personal. Every recommendation carried the memory of a chair left empty at a gala, a wedding photograph removed from an office, and a husband who preferred her intelligence without her presence. Callum's attorneys sent letters during those early months. They questioned her ownership claims, challenged her consulting agreements, and warned her against contacting former business partners. Miriam answered each one with dates, signatures, and pages of documentation. Zora never responded emotionally. She did not mention Callum in interviews. She did not post accusations online. She let the records speak. The divorce became final 11 months after she walked out. Callum arrived at the courthouse in a charcoal suit and left through a side entrance. Zora wore a cream coat over a cobalt blue dress. When Miriam handed her the final papers, Zora stood on the courthouse steps and felt the winter air touch her face. There were no cameras and no applause. Still, something inside her settled into place. She was 36 years old, newly divorced, carrying more debt than savings, and standing at the beginning of a life no one else could define. She did not lose weight to become visible. She did not soften her voice to become acceptable. She changed the way she entered a room. Her shoulders opened. Her chin lifted. She stopped choosing clothes designed to make her body disappear and began wearing color, structure, and fabric that honored every curve. Clients noticed before she did. They said she seemed taller. They said her presence filled the space. 3 years after Aaliyah House opened, the company moved into a renovated brick building with tall windows, a photography studio, and 12 employees. On the day the new sign was installed, Zora stood across the street holding a paper cup of coffee. The gold letters caught the morning sun. People passed beneath them without knowing how many quiet nights had built that name. Zora smiled, not because the world had finally noticed her, but because she no longer needed permission to stand where she could be seen. Elias Mercer first noticed Zora in a conference room where 12 men had spent 40 minutes explaining her own market to her. Aaliyah House had been invited to present a national expansion plan to a private investment group downtown, and Zora arrived carrying no assistant, no oversized presentation case, and no need to impress anyone. She wore a deep green suit tailored to her figure, gold earrings, and the calm expression of a woman who had already studied every person at the table. The presentation began well. Her numbers were strong, her projections careful, and her research impossible to dismiss. Then one of the partners leaned back in his chair and suggested that Aaliyah House use a thinner, younger woman as the public face of the brand. He said it would make the company easier to sell. Another man agreed. A third asked whether Zora would consider remaining behind the scenes, where her intelligence could be useful without confusing the message. The room waited for her to soften the moment with a polite laugh. Zora closed her laptop. The quiet click carried farther than anyone expected. She looked at each investor before speaking. Aaliyah House exists because women have spent generations being told that their faces, bodies, and ages are bad for business, she said. I will not build this company by repeating the same insult with better lighting. No one interrupted her. Zora gathered her papers and stood. She did not plead for the funding. She did not defend her beauty or explain her worth. She simply thanked them for their time and walked toward the door. Elias Mercer had been sitting near the end of the table, silent through most of the meeting. At 45, he had built Mercer Legacy Foundation into one of the most respected cultural investment organizations in the Midwest. He was known for listening longer than other men and speaking only when he had something worth saying. He followed Zora into the hallway. You were right to leave, he said. Zora turned, expecting another negotiation disguised as praise. Elias handed her a simple white business card. When you want an investor who understands that your vision does not need to be corrected, call me. She studied his face. There was no charm in his expression, no attempt to rescue her from disappointment. Only respect. Zora placed the card inside her portfolio and continued toward the elevator. She waited 3 weeks before calling. Their first meeting took place at a quiet restaurant in Hyde Park. Elias asked about customer retention, manufacturing risk, and long-term ownership. He did not ask whether she planned to change her appearance. He did not suggest replacing her with someone more acceptable to national retailers. When she described building a media division for mature women and plus-size consumers, he took notes. When she disagreed with one of his forecasts, he smiled and asked her to show him where his reasoning had failed. That question changed something in her. Callum had always treated disagreement as disloyalty. Elias treated it as evidence that she was paying attention. Mercer Legacy Foundation invested in Aaliyah House under terms that left Zora in control. The capital allowed her to hire designers, expand the research team, and open a production studio on the South Side. Within 18 months, Aaliyah House campaigns appeared in department stores across 5 states. Sales climbed, but Zora measured success differently. She kept letters from women who said they had seen themselves in an advertisement for the first time. She framed one from a 62-year-old teacher who bought a red dress after decades of choosing gray. Elias never took credit for what followed. At company events, he introduced Zora as the founder before mentioning his own role. He stood beside her without stepping in front of her. Their friendship deepened through early flights, late strategy meetings, and long walks after difficult negotiations. He learned when she needed advice and when she only needed silence. Zora learned that respect could feel steady instead of dramatic. One evening, after a successful launch, they stood on the roof of the Aaliyah building as Chicago lights stretched toward the lake. Elias raised a paper cup of coffee and said, "You built a place where people do not have to disappear." Zora looked through the windows below, where her team was still laughing around a table covered with fabric samples. For once, being seen did not feel dangerous. It felt like home. 6 years after Zora rented the narrow room above the bakery, Aaliyah House occupied 3 floors of a restored building overlooking the Chicago River. Its campaigns appeared in national magazines, its designs filled major department stores, and its research division advised companies that once would not have returned her calls. Yet the morning that changed everything began quietly. Zora was standing near the windows of her office, reviewing fabric samples under pale winter light, when her assistant placed a black envelope on the desk. The paper was thick, the lettering pressed in gold. The Halston Cultural Impact Gala invited Zora Whitmore to attend as the evening's principal honoree. She read the line twice. The event would take place at the same museum where Callum had once denied knowing her as his wife. For a moment, the room around her seemed to narrow. She remembered cold marble beneath her heels, champagne sparkling beneath chandeliers, and the practiced ease in Callum's voice when he erased 12 years of marriage. Her hand rested on the envelope, steady but still. Then she noticed the sponsor list. Voss Capital appeared near the top. Across town, Callum was facing a crisis he could no longer control with charm. One of his largest redevelopment projects had drawn public criticism after longtime black residents learned that rising rents might force them from the neighborhood. Investors were nervous. Community leaders refused private meetings. The company's polished statements only made the anger grow. Callum's board wanted a respected partner with cultural credibility, and Aaliyah House was the name repeated in every discussion. Callum knew the brand, of course. Everyone did. He had seen its advertisements in airports, read articles about its expansion, and heard executives praise its founder for understanding markets others had ignored. What he did not know was that Zora had deliberately remained out of the spotlight during the company's early years. Aaliyah House had spoken through its work, while she built power without asking the public to memorize her face. When Callum saw her name on the gala invitation, he assumed she had been included as a former consultant or community representative. He did not connect her to the company his future now depended on. Zora accepted the invitation without hesitation. She did not call Miriam to discuss legal strategy. She did not ask Elias whether attending was wise. She had spent too many years allowing other people to decide which rooms were safe for her. That afternoon, Elias found her in the design studio, where a tailor was pinning the hem of a metallic gold gown. The dress curved across one shoulder and fell in clean, elegant lines that honored her body instead of disguising it. Elias paused at the doorway, then smiled. "That room is not ready for you," he said. Zora looked at her reflection. Her hair fell in soft waves over one shoulder. Gold light moved across the fabric as she turned. "It does not need to be," she replied. In the days before the gala, invitations, interviews, and requests filled her schedule. Her team prepared the announcement of a new community investment fund, while Mercer Legacy Foundation quietly completed negotiations connected to the troubled Voss project. Zora reviewed every agreement herself. She insisted that residents receive protection from displacement, local businesses receive priority contracts, and families gain an ownership share in the development. Elias watched her mark changes in the margins with a gold pen. He never asked whether Callum's name affected her judgment. He already knew the answer. On the evening of the gala, a car waited outside Zora's home as snow began to dust the sidewalks. She fastened diamond earrings, lifted a small gold clutch, and studied herself once in the hallway mirror. There was no anger in her face, no fear, only recognition. The woman looking back at her had not returned to prove that Callum had been wrong. She was going because the city had finally opened a door she no longer needed anyone else to hold. When she stepped outside, camera lights flashed beyond the falling snow, and Chicago began to turn its attention toward the woman it had once failed to see. The line of black cars moved slowly beneath the museum's illuminated columns, but when Zora stepped onto the carpet, the noise changed. Camera shutters accelerated. Reporters leaned forward behind the velvet rope. A television host who had spent the evening calling after celebrities lowered her microphone and said Zora's name with sudden recognition. Zora paused only long enough for the photographers to see her clearly. The metallic gold gown caught the light with every breath, its clean lines following her curves without apology. Her shoulders were relaxed, her chin slightly raised, and the small smile on her face revealed nothing the crowd had not earned. Elias stepped from the car behind her in a midnight blue tuxedo. He did not place a guiding hand at her back or move ahead to lead her. He simply matched her pace as they entered the museum together. Inside, the marble hall glowed beneath crystal chandeliers and warm gallery lights. Conversations softened as guests turned toward the entrance. Zora recognized faces from magazine covers, boardrooms, and city committees. What surprised her was how many of them recognized her first. A famous actress crossed the room to embrace her and thank her for an Aaliyah campaign that featured women over 50. The president of a national department store introduced Zora to two governors as the most disciplined strategist in American retail. A black architect from the South Side pressed both of Zora's hands and told her that the new community fund had given his firm its first major public contract. Each greeting carried a piece of the life she had built after leaving. Across the hall, Callum stood beside three members of the Voss Capital board. He was wearing a black tuxedo cut with the same expensive precision he had always trusted to speak for him. For several seconds, he did not understand why the room was moving around Zora. He watched a senator lean closer to hear her. He watched photographers ignore a movie star to capture her smile. He watched Elias remain near her without claiming attention that belonged to her. Then Zora turned slightly, and Callum saw her face beneath the light. The color left his expression. One of the board members followed his gaze and asked whether he knew her. Callum did not answer at once. 6 years collapsed into a single image. Zora holding coffee in the hallway while his executive team posed for a photograph. Zora waiting alone in a car outside an investor dinner. Zora standing near him at this same museum while he told a reporter she worked for him. She had not become unrecognizable. She had become impossible to ignore. Callum excused himself and crossed the room. Guests shifted aside for him, though not with the admiration they once had. Zora was speaking with a group of young designers when she sensed him near her. She finished the conversation before turning. Z, he said softly, using the name he had called her during the first years of their marriage. Elias remained several feet away. He did not intervene. He understood that Zora required no protection from a past she had already survived. Callum searched her face for anger, warmth, or any sign that the old name still had power. He found courtesy, nothing more. Mr. Voss, Zora said. The formality struck him harder than cruelty would have. He glanced around at the people watching them, then lowered his voice. You look extraordinary. Zora adjusted the gold clutch in her hand. I always did. Callum's mouth opened, but no answer came. Before he could recover, the museum director approached with an eager smile. Ms. Whitmore, they are ready for you backstage. She turned to Callum and added, the entire city has been waiting to hear from the woman behind Aaliyah House. Callum stared at Zora as the meaning settled across his face. For years, he had believed the company was merely another powerful name his board hoped to secure. He had never imagined that its founder was the woman he had trained himself not to see. Zora gave him one final, calm nod and walked toward the stage. The crowd parted before her. Behind her, Callum remained beneath the chandeliers, surrounded by hundreds of people and more alone than he had ever allowed her to feel. The lights above the stage softened as Zora stepped behind the podium, and the applause rose before she said a word. Callum stood near the center of the hall, surrounded by board members who were no longer watching him. They were watching her. On the screen behind Zora appeared the gold emblem of Aaliyah House, followed by images of women from across the country. Teachers, business owners, mothers, designers, women with gray hair, dark skin, full figures, and steady eyes. Zora looked across the room and spoke without hurry. She thanked the employees who had built the company beside her, the customers who had trusted its message, and the communities that had refused to accept invisibility as a permanent condition. Then the museum director returned to the microphone. She announced that Aaliyah House had created one of the largest privately funded neighborhood preservation programs in Illinois. The audience applauded again, but Callum barely heard it. A member of his board leaned close and whispered, "This is the partner we have been trying to secure." Callum's gaze remained fixed on Zora. He understood now why every call to Aaliyah House had been handled through legal representatives, why no meeting had been confirmed, and why the company had requested full access to the redevelopment records. Zora had not avoided him out of fear. She had been studying the structure he believed only he controlled. The director then introduced Elias Mercer as chairman of Mercer Legacy Foundation. Elias joined Zora on stage and explained that the foundation had acquired a major portion of the debt connected to the Voss Capital redevelopment project. A restless silence moved through the room. Callum's board members straightened in their seats. One of them closed his eyes briefly, as if the final piece of a difficult calculation had fallen into place. Elias continued. Mercer Legacy would not approve the next financing phase unless the project adopted a new ownership model. Then he turned toward Zora and stepped away from the microphone. The person who designed that model should explain it, he said. He did not announce her as his partner, his discovery, or the woman he had helped. He simply gave the room back to her. Zora unfolded a single sheet of paper. Her voice remained calm as she described the terms. Current residents would receive long-term protections against displacement. Local businesses would receive priority access to commercial leases. A community trust would hold an ownership share in the development, allowing neighborhood families to benefit from future growth instead of being pushed aside by it. Aurelia House would oversee public accountability, and Mercer Legacy would release funding only after each condition was legally secured. The final slide appeared behind her. It showed the full list of approved terms and, at the bottom, the signatures of the Voss Capital Board. Callum turned toward his directors. None of them met his eyes. They had accepted the agreement. That afternoon, to prevent the company from losing its largest project, his title remained unchanged, but the decision that would define his legacy no longer belonged to him. Zora had not taken his company. She had done something more precise. She had placed responsibility where his pride had failed. When the applause began, it was not loud at first. It started with the residents seated in the front row. An older woman in a navy dress stood and pressed one hand over her heart. A young father beside her rose next. Then architects, store owners, city officials, and guests throughout the hall followed until nearly everyone was standing. Zora did not look at Callum. Her eyes remained on the families whose homes had become numbers in one of his reports. Callum watched her accept their gratitude with the same quiet grace she had once offered him when no one knew her name. He remembered every presentation she had prepared, every warning he had dismissed, and every room where he had asked her to remain unseen. Now the entire city was standing because she had chosen to be visible on behalf of others. As Zora left the podium, Elias offered his hand. She took it, not because she needed help crossing the stage, but because respect had never required her to become smaller. Callum remained seated beneath the bright museum lights, holding a program that listed her name above his company's, while the future of everything he had built moved forward without waiting for his permission. The applause followed Zora into the corridor, fading only after the heavy gallery doors closed behind her. For the first time that evening, the museum felt quiet. Warm light spilled across the marble floor, and beyond the tall windows, snow drifted through the Chicago night. Zora paused near a display of old photographs, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted one private breath before returning to the crowd. She heard Callum approach before he spoke. His footsteps were slower than she remembered. Zora. This time, he did not use the old nickname. She turned and found him standing several feet away, his hands empty, his expression stripped of the confidence he had worn all evening. For years, he had known how to control a room with the angle of his smile and the careful weight of his voice. Now he looked like a man who had finally entered a room where none of those things belonged to him. "I owe you an apology," he said. Zora waited. Callum glanced toward the closed doors behind them. "I told myself I was protecting the company. I told myself that people were cruel and that I was keeping you away from that." His voice lowered. "But I was protecting myself. I was afraid of what they might think of me." Zora held his gaze. The honesty had arrived years too late, but she did not look away from it. "You were not afraid they would hurt me," she said. "You were afraid they would judge you for loving me." Callum's face tightened. "I did love you. You loved what I gave you," Zora replied. "You loved my work, my patience, and the way I made your life easier. But love does not ask someone to disappear." He stepped closer, then stopped when she did not move. "I know that now." The words hung between them, fragile and useless against the years behind them. He told her that the penthouse had never felt like home after she left. He admitted that every success afterward had seemed smaller because he knew whose ideas had built the foundation. He said he had followed Aurelia House from a distance without realizing that the mind behind it had always been hers. Then his voice broke into something quieter. "Is there any chance for us?" Zora looked through the window at the city lights stretching toward the lake. Once, that question would have opened every wound she had worked to close. Now it reached her like a sound from another room. "No," she said gently. Callum lowered his eyes. She did not enjoy the pain in his face. That was the difference between revenge and freedom. "I am sorry," he said again. "I believe you," Zora answered. "But your regret is not a future for me." The gallery doors opened behind them, and laughter drifted into the corridor. Elias stood at the far end, speaking with two community leaders. He saw Zora and remained where he was. He did not call her name or come forward to claim her attention. He trusted her to finish her own story. Callum followed her gaze and understood. "He sees you," he said. Zora turned back to him. "I see myself." Then she walked past him. Outside the main hall, Several women from Aurelia House were waiting beneath the bright museum lights. One wore the red dress, inspired by the letter from the retired teacher. Another held the hand of her teenage daughter. When Zora appeared, they made room for her at the center without asking. Camera flashes filled the entrance. Zora stood among them, her gold gown glowing against the marble, her face calm and open. Behind the glass doors, Callum remained alone in the corridor, watching the world welcome the woman he had once hidden. Zora did not turn around. She had not returned so he could finally see her. She had returned because she no longer needed his eyes to know who she was.